I always find myself in an interesting position here where I have to fill in gaps with theory and practice knowledge here because of the disconnects between the real world and what the data can tell us.
You're essentially offering the discussion point that it's often claimed that essentially volume load progression or your sets and reps at a fixed RAR or your load and your reps at a fixed RAR is essentially the best proxy that we have of muscle growth. Muscle growth is very hard to measure in practice. You can try triangulating that with body mass and skinfold measurements or circumferences, things like that. But at the end of the day, most people are probably suggesting that performance is kind of our best indicator of that.
Yeah.
And so the practical question there is there's kind of two ways you can view that. It's keeping a pulse on that and kind of viewing it in a binary, let's say, is something we've discussed a few times. Am I making progress or am I regressing? Kind of in a binary like that. The second way, which is the kind of the claim that's mentioned, is the approach that's going to maximize my volume load progression, or even just looking at
just strength and
standalone performance on an exercise, let's say. That is the approach that also maximizes hypertrophy. That's the claim that kind of is out there that you guys kind of want to dig into. I just wanted to rephrase because I think that's really, really important to get crystal clear in terms of the implications there.
Perfect.
Yeah, I think this is one of those ones where you really do have to extrapolate outside of the data, because the same issues we have with the short-term nature of hypertrophy research is the same issue we have with the short-term nature of strength research. We have slightly longer studies because it's easier to keep people around. And if you've got the equipment to do a training study, you've got the equipment to test strength, but you don't necessarily have an ultrasound or an MRI. And that's why you guys have twice as many participants in your analysis of strength and hypertrophy, right? It's like 2,000-ish versus 1,000.
Yep.
But I think I always find myself in an interesting position here where I have to fill in gaps with theory and practice knowledge here because of the disconnects between the real world and what the data can tell us. I'm not even necessarily comfortable framing it the way you guys did, because I think there's a little more of a black box of what's going on. I wouldn't say that the change in strength is related to the change in hypertrophy or the time course that we typically measure it in training studies. And in fact, we know it's not. They don't share that strong of a relationship if we just look at a pre-post measure like that. I also wouldn't say that in the time courses we study, if you look at just the progression in a training program, we look at like the volume load changes, is related or predictive of the rate of hypertrophy over that time course. But then I also know that when we look at data on strength athletes across the board, we see that acute measurements of hypertrophy explain the highest amount of variance of their performance and discriminate between higher and lower performers in, say, powerlifting. It's been shown like 4 or 5 times. And we've even got some studies that have recently come out showing that the change in certain hypertrophy metrics predicts the change in a 1RM in competition. There's a Tremaris paper that came out that was 12 weeks long looking at this in powerlifters, which is pretty interesting. And we also have data which really make it difficult to think of a world where hypertrophy isn't influencing strength. I've tried to go that old steel manning process we did earlier on this one to check myself on this. And where I really come down to going, okay, I have a tough time thinking that hypertrophy doesn't influence strength is when we take training out of the equation. When you see that doses of testosterone result in proportionally higher increases in strength, like the Bayesian studies, or we see myostatin inhibition in animal models resulting in increases in strength, or we see stretching when the absence of training improves isometric force or dynamic force production for that given muscle when you test it, like in some of the boot stretching stuff that Warnicki has done, and then testing calf strength or isometric strength. So I am a pretty strong believer that not only is strength related to hypertrophy, but then at a certain point in your expertise with a given movement, or if you'd remove expertise from the equation and you're a more advanced quote unquote lifter, it probably explains the majority of your strength. We've actually got a few studies now when we look at like isometric relationships. And if you just pull anybody out of a crowd, the thing that's going to probably predict their isometric quadricep strength is going to be their quadricep cross-sectional area or volume. When we compare an untrained person to a trained person, and we even do some assessments of our best guess at how do we measure, say, like voluntary contraction ability or quote unquote their ability to neuromuscularly produce force, that explains far less of the variance than morphological factors. So how do I hold that to be true and also say that I don't think the proportional change in progressive overload or the pre-post change in a strength measure is related to hypertrophy? It really comes down to time course.
Ultimately, I think the reason I asked that question is because I think people really like to use that in a much shorter time scale to say whether I'm on the right track or not. And I think the shorter time scale that you're using it relative to your advancement, the more likely there are other things that are explaining the differences in volume load than the thing that you actually want to be explaining it. So if I'm using volume load to guide my training prescriptions in a very short term for an advanced athlete, that's probably not indicative of the actual outcome that I'm trying to optimize my training for. And it's much more likely to be indicative of the things that bias my performance. So point being, you could create a theoretical example that I just gave a softball pitch in terms of 2 times the progress that I did in reality now. But I think first and foremost, I think that's rarely ever the case. Like, I don't think it'd be that noticeable outside of these like extraneous examples where somebody just like simply can't tolerate the training. But it beckons how important it is to like take into account these other things, like evaluating your peak performance on an exercise following a deload from the low volume and the high volume approach, like that gives an example of like how many factors can bias the volume load progression. So ultimately I'm circling in on that. Yes, if a magic fairy could wave a wand and we were able to delineate the multivariate nature of performance and could isolate the hypertrophy contribution part of that equation, that volume load would probably pretty strongly correlate to that.
I think kind of what we're all getting at is that or at least an important practical piece for application here is that these things are quite difficult to measure with a high degree of precision in practice. I think someone that's been coaching for a while or that's been lifting for a while can notice some of these things like higher variability. That's been my experience as well, Eric. Or they can just notice when okay, this improvement in performance has been sustained longer than I would just expect from something like a taper, right? Those are things that you kind of start to pick up on, and I think it's just kind of the skill of training and coaching that comes with time. But I think a pretty solid recommendation or a pretty solid thing to look out for that's easy is progress occurring in the binary sense over a pretty long time period, right? I think you can definitely get lost in the weeds if you try to get really specific with the rate of progress and comparing that over time.
Which I've done many a time.
Yeah, yep. We've been guilty of that.
Where it comes from.
And I think ultimately, again, to use a word you used before, it's quite empowering that hopefully our framework here that we're landing on with the current data and our current thinking, it simplifies things a good amount.